In 1944, the United States Army secretly commissioned a study to determine whether marijuana made soldiers more likely to talk under interrogation. The study found that it did not. The government buried the results for 30 years. The year is 1619, and somewhere in the colony of Virginia, a law has just been passed. Not a law against cannabis, a law requiring its cultivation. Every landowner in the colony is legally obligated to grow hemp or face a fine. The penalty for refusing to plant it is the same as the penalty for refusing to pay taxes. The plant in question has been growing somewhere on Earth for roughly 12,000 years. It has been used as rope, as food, as cloth, as medicine, as sacrament. It has been burned in temples, pressed into oil, woven into sails that carried explorers across unknown oceans. For most of its history, no one thought to make it illegal. The idea would have seemed, to most of human civilization, like passing a law against wheat. And yet, within 3 centuries of that Virginia mandate, the United States federal government would classify cannabis as a Schedule I controlled substance, a drug with no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, placing it in the same legal category as heroin and a more restrictive category than cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. The distance between those two facts, the colonial law that required you to grow it and the federal law that made growing it a felony, is not simply a story about a plant. It is a story about race and fear and political ambition and the particular American talent for transforming something useful into something monstrous through the alchemy of propaganda. There is a woman named Brownie Mary. There is a trumpet player in New Orleans. There is a Mexican general named Pancho Villa, whose soldiers rolled cigarettes the American press would spend 30 years teaching ordinary people to fear. There is a single government official who, more than any other individual in the 20th century, determined what drugs Americans were allowed to use, a man named Harry Anslinger, who had a theory, a typewriter, and almost unlimited federal authority. And underneath all of it, growing quietly in the dark, there is a plant that has been part of human life since before writing existed. Settle in. The story begins a very long time ago. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. A plant without a country. Cannabis sativa has no single homeland. That is its first unusual quality. Most domesticated plants can be traced to a specific region of origin: wheat to the Fertile Crescent, maize to the highlands of Mexico, rice to the Yangtze River Valley. Cannabis is different. Genetic studies suggest it diverged from its closest relative roughly 28 million years ago on the Tibetan Plateau, and from there it spread in every direction, carried by wind, by water, by the slow migration of animals, and eventually by people. By the time human beings began leaving written records, cannabis was already everywhere. It appears in Chinese medical texts dating to roughly 2700 BCE. It appears in the sacred literature of ancient India. Egyptian mummies have been found with cannabis residue in their hair and their lungs. Scythian horsemen riding the steppes of Central Asia built small felt tents over bronze cauldrons and heated the seeds inside until the air was thick with smoke, then sat together in the heat until they cried out in pleasure. Herodotus recorded this practice in the 5th century BCE with the detached curiosity of a man describing someone else's ritual, which is what it was to him. The word cannabis itself is among the oldest loanwords in the English language, inherited from the Greek cannabis, which was itself borrowed from a Semitic root, probably the Akkadian quanabu, through routes of trade so ancient that linguists cannot trace them with certainty. The word was moving between languages before any of those languages had alphabets. What is perhaps most striking about the early history of cannabis is how ordinary it was. No culture that encountered the plant treated it with particular alarm. The Chinese pharmacopoeia, known as the Shenong Benkao Jing, compiled sometime around the 1st century CE but drawing on traditions far older, lists cannabis as one of the 50 fundamental herbs of Chinese medicine. It recommends it for gout, for absent-mindedness, for menstrual irregularity. It does note that consuming too much can produce visions. The text uses the phrase seeing demons and advises moderation. This is not a warning so much as a dosage note, the equivalent of a modern label reading may cause drowsiness. In ancient India, cannabis occupied an even more elevated position. The Atharva Veda, one of the 4 sacred texts of Hinduism, compiled between 1500 and 1000 BCE, names cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants and describes it as a source of happiness and liberation, a compassionate gift from the god Shiva. The bang drink, cannabis leaves and flowers ground with milk, ghee and spices, was consumed during the festival of Holi, offered to guests, given to bridegrooms on their wedding day. This was not a counterculture practice, it was the culture. This is the world the plant comes from, not a world of danger and transgression, but a world in which cannabis was roughly as remarkable as barley, useful, familiar, and deserving of neither particular reverence nor particular fear. The reverence and the fear would come later, and they would come from a much more specific place. Understanding how a plant used by virtually every human civilization across 12,000 years of history became, in the early 20th century, the target of the most sustained government propaganda campaign in American history, requires understanding not the plant but the people who needed it to be dangerous. That story does not begin in a field, it begins in a government office, with a man reading newspaper clippings about Mexican immigrants. But before we reach that office, we should follow the plant itself, across continents, across centuries, through the hands of emperors and healers and sailors and doctors, because the distance between what cannabis was and what it was made to be is, in its own quiet way, one of the stranger journeys in the history of American pharmacology. The 12,000-year relationship between human beings and cannabis is long enough to make most of what humans do with plants look like a brief experiment. Agriculture itself is only about 10,000 years old in most parts of the world. The domestication of the horse is roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years old. Cannabis predates both, and throughout its long history of human use, the plant has been simultaneously a fiber crop, a food source, a medicine, and a sacrament, a combination that reflects its unusual chemical and physical properties and the particular way those properties map onto human needs. The 2 major variants of cannabis, Cannabis sativa, which grows tall and is favoured for fibre production, and Cannabis indica, which grows shorter and bushier and is associated with higher concentrations of psychoactive compounds, are themselves the products of selective human cultivation over millennia. Wild cannabis, growing without human management, tends toward intermediate forms. The clear distinctions between varieties that cannabis users and regulators now take for granted are the product of thousands of years of cultivation pressure, as farmers selected plants for the characteristics they needed: more fibre, more seed oil, more resin, more potency, or more reliability of growth. The economic history of cannabis is itself a story worth telling at length. The global hemp fibre trade was, for much of human history, one of the largest commodity trades in existence. At the height of the British Empire, hemp was second only to cotton in terms of the volume of plant fibre traded globally. The Russian Empire's dominance of European hemp supply through the 17th and 18th centuries was a factor in European geopolitics. Britain's dependence on Russian hemp for naval cordage was a constant source of strategic anxiety, and the desire to develop domestic hemp supply in the American colonies was, as we have seen, one of the motivations for colonial hemp cultivation policies. The question of why cannabis became a target of American prohibition in the 1930s, rather than in some earlier or later period, is worth asking precisely. Several factors converged. The Depression-era political environment created both fiscal pressure on federal agencies to justify their existence and social anxiety that was easily directed at minority populations. The end of Prohibition in 1933 left the Federal Bureau of Narcotics without its primary enforcement mandate, and with a commissioner who needed a new mission. The demographic shifts produced by Mexican immigration created a visible new population to associate with the substance, and the newspaper industry, for its own commercial reasons, found that alarming stories about drug-crazed minorities sold papers. None of these factors was by itself sufficient to produce prohibition. Together at this particular moment they were. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of drug prohibition. The classification of a substance as dangerous rarely reflects a dispassionate assessment of its pharmacology. It reflects a political environment in which the substance's associations can be leveraged for purposes that have little to do with the substance itself. The lesson is not that all prohibited substances are harmless. It is that the process by which substances are prohibited is not primarily a scientific process and should not be evaluated as if it were. If any of this is settling into sleep, good. Before you go, what's the oldest use of cannabis you'd ever heard of before tonight? Leave it in the comments when you wake. The sacred smoke, what the ancients already knew. In 2019, archaeologists excavating a roughly 2,500-year-old cemetery in the Pamir Mountains of western China made a discovery that upended several assumptions about ancient drug use. Inside a series of wooden braziers, small portable burners found in the tombs of what appeared to be religious figures, they found stones that had been superheated, and around those stones traces of cannabis with a THC content significantly higher than wild plants from the same region. Someone, 25 centuries ago, had deliberately cultivated high-potency cannabis for use in a ritual context. The careful selection of specific strains for specific psychoactive properties is not, it turns out, a modern innovation. The Pamir Cemetery connects to a broader world. The people buried there were part of the Silk Road network: traders, religious figures, travellers moving between the civilizations of Central Asia in an era when ideas and plants moved as freely as silk. Cannabis was one of the things they carried, and the versions they carried were not the same as the versions that grew wild in the valleys. Cultivation had been going on long enough to produce meaningful variation. In China, the relationship with cannabis was older still and more thoroughly domestic. The Chinese character for hemp, MR, appears in oracle bone script dating to the Shang dynasty, roughly 1200 BCE, in contexts that suggest it was already a well-established crop with a recognizable name. Chinese farmers grew hemp for its fiber. The stalks produced rope and cloth of considerable durability, but the seeds were also eaten, pressed for oil, and incorporated into medical preparations that were recorded and refined over millennia. The Shenong Benkao Jing's description of cannabis as a treatment for more than 100 ailments reflects a tradition of empirical observation stretching back far earlier than the text itself. Chinese physicians noted that cannabis slowed digestion, reduced inflammation, relieved the pain of injuries, and produced in larger quantities effects they described in terms of spiritual experience. The distinction between medical and ceremonial use was, for most of Chinese history, a distinction without much practical meaning. The same plant served both purposes, and the same practitioners managed both. India developed a parallel but distinct tradition. Where Chinese use was largely practical and medical, Indian cannabis culture wove the plant into the deeper structures of religious life. The Vedic texts describe bhang, a preparation of cannabis leaves, as one of 5 nectars of the gods, and the god Shiva himself is said to have discovered the plant's properties by resting beneath a cannabis plant during a period of distress and consuming its leaves. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense. It is an origin story that placed cannabis inside the divine order of things, which meant that consuming it was, under certain circumstances, an act of devotion. The bhang tradition that developed from these texts was elaborate and socially sanctioned in ways that bear little resemblance to the illegal back-alley transaction that American drug policy would later construct around the same plant. Bhang was sold legally in government-licensed shops. It was consumed communally. It was given to soldiers before battle to calm their nerves. It was administered to the sick, the grieving, the sleepless. When the British colonial government in India studied cannabis use in the 1890s, producing a 3,000-page report known as the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission Report, the most thorough government investigation of cannabis ever conducted up to that point, they concluded that moderate use was relatively harmless, and that prohibition would be both impractical and unjust. The report was largely ignored. In ancient Egypt, cannabis appears in medical papyri dating to approximately 1550 BCE. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, describes a preparation of cannabis administered vaginally to ease the pain of childbirth. The Ramesseum Papyrus describes it as a treatment for inflammation of the eyes. That second preparation is particularly striking. The compound being described, some researchers believe, may have been functioning as a form of glaucoma treatment millennia before the condition was named. The Scythians, whose cannabis ritual Herodotus observed, were nomadic warriors who ranged across the Eurasian steppe from what is now Iran to the Black Sea. They were accomplished enough militarily that the Persians, at the height of their imperial power, chose not to invade Scythian territory. And they built dedicated steam bath structures, smaller versions of what would later become saunas, in which cannabis seeds were heated on stones and the resulting vapour inhaled collectively, Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, called the result something that no Grecian vapor bath can surpass. He described men crying out in pleasure. He seemed genuinely impressed. What unifies these ancient traditions, Chinese, Indian, Egyptian, Scythian, is not a shared understanding of cannabis in any pharmacological sense. They had no knowledge of THC, no understanding of the endocannabinoid system, no shared vocabulary of drug mechanisms. What they shared was observation. The plant produced certain effects. Those effects could be useful or pleasurable or both, depending on circumstance. It was treated accordingly. There is something clarifying about that plainness. These were civilizations sophisticated enough to build empires, to develop written language, to track the movements of planets. They were not naive about the difference between a useful plant and a dangerous one, and they looked at cannabis and saw overwhelmingly something useful. The assessment would persist for thousands of years, through the Islamic Golden Age, through the Renaissance, through the Colonial period, without significant challenge. It would take a very specific set of circumstances, in a very specific country, at a very specific moment in history, to transform that assessment entirely, and even then, it would require a considerable amount of deliberate misrepresentation to make the transformation stick. But that is a chapter for later. For now, the smoke rises from the Pamir braziers, and the men who place the stones there are performing a ritual so old that its origins are lost, in a tradition so widespread that it touched every corner of the known world. They would not have understood if you could have told them what their plant would eventually be accused of. The Yanghai tombs, excavated in China's Xinjiang province between 2003 and 2006, yielded one of the most remarkable cannabis finds in archaeological history. In Tomb 90, researchers uncovered the body of a man estimated to have been between 45 and 55 years old at death, surrounded by burial goods consistent with a person of some spiritual authority. Beside him, carefully arranged, was a quantity of cannabis plant material, approximately 789 grams of it, the seeds and flowering heads separated and stored in a wooden bowl, the stems kept aside. The material was approximately 2,700 years old. The THC content, when tested, was negligible. The compound had degraded over millennia, but the deliberate arrangement of the material and the context of the burial suggested strongly that this individual's relationship with cannabis had been significant enough to accompany him into death. The question of why this man's cannabis was buried with him, why whoever prepared his tomb considered it essential grave goods, is one that archaeologists have discussed at length without arriving at a definitive answer. Was it a symbol of his role as a healer, a provision for a journey, an offering? The plant clearly meant something. What it meant precisely is lost with the man himself. In ancient India, the mythology surrounding cannabis was specific and detailed in ways that suggest long familiarity. The Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit epic whose composition began roughly 400 BCE, though its oral roots are older, contains references to Pang as a gift from the gods. The Shiva Purana describes the god discovering cannabis beneath a tree during a period of conflict with his consort Parvati, and finding that its consumption restored his equilibrium. These are not incidental references. They are part of a theological framework in which cannabis was understood as a tool for managing the extremes of divine and human emotion, for finding the middle ground between ecstasy and despair. The Atharva Veda's naming of cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants, alongside barley, soma, daba grass and rice, placed it in company that defined agricultural and ceremonial life. Rice and barley fed people. Soma, a ritual drink whose precise botanical identity has been debated by scholars for more than a century, induced altered states in Vedic ceremonies. Cannabis occupied a position somewhere between those two functions. Food that was also sacrament, medicine that was also ritual. The Scythian hemp tradition that Herodotus described in the 5th century BCE deserves more attention than it typically receives in Western historical accounts. The Scythians were not a primitive people performing crude rituals. They were the dominant military power of the Eurasian steppe for several centuries. Skilled horsemen, sophisticated metallurgists, and active traders who maintained contact with the Greek world, the Persian Empire, and the civilizations of Central Asia simultaneously. The hemp ritual was not unique to them. Archaeological evidence of similar practices has been found across a broad swathe of steppe territory. suggesting that the communal cannabis ritual was an established institution across multiple related cultures. What Herodotus understood about the ritual was limited by his position as an outsider, and by the fact that he was describing it from second-hand accounts as much as direct observation. He focused on the pleasure it produced, the cries of joy, the comparison to steam baths, but the ritual was almost certainly serving functions beyond recreation. Steam baths in many cultures serve purification purposes. The gathering of men within a shared enclosed space to breathe a common substance is a bonding ritual as much as a pleasure ritual. The cannabis may have been one element of a ceremony whose full meaning Herodotus, writing in Greek for a Greek audience, could only partially access. Egypt's relationship with cannabis was more varied than the medical papyri alone suggest. The word semsemti appears in Egyptian hieroglyphic texts with enough frequency and in enough different contexts that some Egyptologists believe it referred to cannabis in multiple forms, as fiber plant, as medicinal herb, and possibly as ritual material. Pollen analysis of the mummified remains of Rameses II, who died around 1213 BCE, detected cannabis pollen, which some researchers take as evidence of use during his lifetime, though the presence of pollen could also reflect the plant's presence in the burial environment. The funerary texts of the Egyptian Book of the Dead contain references to a green emerald plant given to the deceased by the gods in the afterlife, a plant described as conferring both sustenance and clarity of perception. Whether this represents cannabis is contested. The description fits in some ways, it does not fit in others. The uncertainty reflects a broader challenge in the study of ancient drug use, identifying substances from texts written by people for whom those substances were so familiar that they required no botanical precision in naming them. What is clear across all of these ancient contexts is that cannabis occupied a specific and recognized position in the pharmacological and spiritual imagination of the cultures that used it. It was known to have effects. Those effects were documented, categorized, incorporated into medical systems, and in many cases invested with theological significance. The people who used it were not confused about what it was or what it did. They were, in most cases, managing their use of it with the same practical intelligence they brought to the management of any other significant resource. The notion that the psychoactive properties of cannabis were somehow accidentally discovered or intermittently known until modern science arrived to explain them is not supported by the evidence. The ancients knew. They had known for a very long time. The knowledge was expressed in different vocabularies, spiritual rather than pharmacological, observational rather than mechanistic, but it was real knowledge derived from real observation, and it informed real practice across centuries of continuous use. In the Scythian graves, in the Yanghai tombs, in the Sanskrit texts, in the Chinese herbals, in the Ebers papyrus, the record of human beings and cannabis extends further back than writing itself. The relationship predates the civilizations that eventually wrote it down. By the time anyone thought to call it dangerous, it had been familiar for longer than most things that human beings had ever called familiar. The Arab world's gift, how cannabis crossed into Western medicine. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, it took with it much of the formal medical knowledge that Greek and Roman physicians had accumulated over several centuries. The libraries burned or dispersed. The trade networks that had carried exotic plant materials across the Mediterranean fragmented. In the centuries that followed, European medicine contracted dramatically, becoming something practiced mostly in monasteries, often with plants that grew in monastery gardens, useful but limited. While Europe contracted, the Islamic world expanded. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, Arab scholars and physicians collected, translated, and extended Greek and Roman medical knowledge on a scale that had no parallel in any other civilization of the period. They built hospitals, bimaristans, that functioned more like modern medical institutions than anything Europe would produce for another 500 years. They developed pharmacology as a systematic discipline, and they wrote about cannabis. The Arab physician Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known in Europe as Rhazes, was practicing medicine in Baghdad in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. He described cannabis preparations for ear pain, noting that the oil pressed from seeds, warmed and dropped into the ear canal, could relieve the kind of chronic ache that medieval patients had almost no other treatment for. His contemporary, the encyclopedist al-Biruni, documented cannabis cultivation across Central Asia with enough botanical precision that his descriptions remain useful to researchers today. Al-Biruni noted that some communities used cannabis recreationally and observed this without apparent alarm. The most influential Islamic medical scholar to address cannabis at length was Ibn Sina, known to European physicians as Avicenna, whose encyclopedic Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025 CE, became one of the most widely read medical texts in both the Islamic world and eventually medieval Europe. Ibn Sina was cautious about cannabis in ways that distinguished him from earlier writers. He acknowledged its medical utility, particularly as a diuretic and in treating flatulence and ear conditions, but noted that excessive use could produce melancholy and over time harm the digestive system. His caution was practical rather than moral. He was a physician observing outcomes, not a moralist making pronouncements. Cannabis entered European medicine largely through the translations of these Arabic texts, which began filtering into European universities in the 11th and 12th centuries through the contact zones of Sicily and Spain, where Islamic and Christian civilizations intersected. A translator named Gerard of Cremona, working in Toledo in the 12th century, produced Latin versions of Ibn Sina and other Arab physicians that became standard medical texts at European universities for the next 3 centuries. Cannabis preparations described in those texts became part of European medical practice through that channel. What is historically significant about this transmission is what it reveals about the plant's reputation at the point of transfer. Cannabis was being imported into European medicine not as an exotic curiosity or a dangerous substance to be approached with extreme caution, but as a practical remedy with known properties and established uses. It arrived with a pharmacological pedigree. Physicians who read about it in the canon of medicine encountered not a warning but a recipe. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean trade networks that connected the Arab world to East Africa and South Asia, cannabis was moving in less formal ways, carried by sailors, traded in port markets, consumed in the hashish preparations that were spreading gradually westward from Persia and Central Asia. Hashish, concentrated cannabis resin, was a distinct preparation from the plant material most cultures had used, and it produced more intense effects. Arab medical writers noted these effects with varying degrees of concern. Some described therapeutic applications. Others, particularly in later centuries, worried about its capacity for what they called thought disorder in excessive users. The 1001 Nights story, the Tales from 1001 Nights, contains several references to hashish that are illuminating precisely because they are casual. Characters encounter hashish in markets, at inns, in the possession of ordinary travellers. It is not presented as particularly remarkable. In one tale, a man is tricked into consuming a large quantity of hashish and wakes up in an unfamiliar palace, convinced he is a different person. The story uses hashish as a plot device the way a modern writer might use a sedative or a sleeping potion, as something the audience is assumed to be familiar with and capable of understanding without explanation. This casual familiarity characterized much of the Middle Eastern and Central Asian relationship with cannabis through the medieval period. It was common enough to be mentioned without explanation, used widely enough to appear in trade records and tax documents, and understood well enough that writers could assume their readers had opinions about it. The great Persian poet Hafiz wrote about hashish in the 14th century, in terms that mixed personal pleasure with mild philosophical observation. The Ottoman Sultan Selim I is said to have been an enthusiastic consumer. His enemies called him Selim the Grim. Whether the hashish had anything to do with the grimness is not recorded. By the 15th century, cannabis had completed a journey that had taken several thousand years. It had moved from the Tibetan plateau to China, from Central Asia to India, from the Eurasian steppe to the Mediterranean, from the Islamic world to Europe. It had been used by emperors and peasants, priests and physicians, soldiers and poets. Every major civilization that encountered it had found something to do with it, and most of them had decided it was moderately useful and not particularly dangerous. The plant would make another ocean crossing in the next century, this time on Spanish ships heading west, and when it arrived in the Americas, it would begin a new chapter in a new world, one that would eventually produce the particular crisis of the 20th century. But the crisis would not come from the plant. It would come from what people chose to say about it. The translation movement that brought Islamic medical knowledge into European universities was not a smooth or rapid process. It took place over approximately 2 centuries, from the late 10th through the 12th centuries, and it required not only the translation of Arabic texts into Latin, but the development of a new Latin medical vocabulary capable of expressing concepts that Greek and Roman medicine had not addressed. The translators who did this work, many of them working in the multicultural border zones of Sicily and Spain, where Arabic, Hebrew and Latin coexisted, were doing something more complex than converting words from one language to another. They were converting systems of thought. Cannabis occupied a specific and practically useful role in this translation project. It was a substance with documented properties, a consistent name across multiple traditions, and clear applications that did not require philosophical framework to understand. A physician reading Gerard of Cremona's Latin version of Ibn Sina could encounter cannabis preparation techniques, dosing guidelines, and clinical observations that could be applied directly in European practice. The plant was available. It grew across much of Europe as a fibre crop, and the preparations described were not chemically exotic. Cannabis tinctures could be made from materials that any European apothecary could source. What European physicians received through these translations was not a simple set of recipes, but a coherent pharmacological tradition. Ibn Sina's canon of medicine was not a collection of folk remedies. It was a systematic attempt to classify and explain the mechanisms by which medicines acted on the body, drawing on Greek humoral theory as its theoretical framework while adding substantial original clinical observation. His discussion of cannabis placed it within this framework. It was warming and drying in the third degree, which in humoral terms meant it was suited for conditions characterized by cold and damp, such as certain respiratory complaints and joint inflammations. The humoral classification was wrong in ways that would not become apparent until the development of biochemistry centuries later. But it was not arbitrary. It was an attempt to systematize observations that were real. Cannabis did produce effects that could be described as warming in the sense of increasing circulation and metabolic activity, and to make those observations actionable for practitioners who needed to know which patients to give it to and which to avoid. The theoretical framework was imperfect. The clinical observations underneath it were often sound. Among the most important and least recognized contributions of Islamic cannabis scholarship was the study of tolerance and dependence. Several Arab physicians noted, with some precision, that regular cannabis users required larger quantities to produce the same effects over time. What modern pharmacology would call tolerance development. Al-Makrizi, an Egyptian historian and encyclopedist writing in the 15th century, described what appeared to be withdrawal symptoms in regular hashish users who stopped abruptly: irritability, loss of appetite, sleep disturbance, general dysphoria. His description, written 500 years before the concept of drug dependence, was formally articulated in Western medicine, is remarkably accurate by modern standards. The spread of hashish through the Middle East and North Africa in the medieval period was not uniformly welcomed. Several Islamic legal scholars issued rulings on hashish that varied considerably in their severity. Some classified it as equivalent to alcohol and therefore forbidden under Islamic law. Others argued that the prohibition of alcohol was specific to alcohol and did not extend to other intoxicating substances. Others distinguished between moderate use, which they tolerated, and excessive use, which they condemned. The debates continued for centuries and were never definitively resolved within Islamic jurisprudence, a fact that reflects the genuine complexity of the question, rather than any lack of engagement with it. The geographic range of the Islamic cannabis tradition extended further than is commonly appreciated. Arab traders carried hashish preparations to sub-Saharan Africa through the trade routes of the East African coast, where cannabis became integrated into local medical and ritual traditions in ways that were distinct from but traceable to the Islamic influence. Ethiopian texts from the medieval period describe cannabis preparations. The Sufi orders, which carried Islamic practice across enormous geographic distances, incorporated cannabis into some of their meditative traditions, particularly in Central Asia and India, in ways that were controversial within mainstream Islamic practice, but persistent enough to survive centuries of official disapproval. The Assassins, the followers of Hassani Sabah who established a network of politically motivated killers in 11th and 12th century Persia and Syria, are often associated with hashish in ways that historians have found difficult to verify. The name assassin is sometimes etymologically linked to hashishin, meaning hashish users. Whether the connection is historical or legendary is a matter of ongoing scholarly dispute. The Crusader accounts that describe the assassins consuming hashish before missions were written by people who understood neither the assassin movement nor the specific role hashish played in Islamic cultures. What is certain is that the association between hashish and political violence, however fictional it may have been, contributed to a European perception of the substance as foreign, dangerous, and associated with mysterious enemy powers. The Stated History Channel has more evenings like this one, the history of laudanum, of heroin, of the patent medicine era. If you'd like to keep going, they're waiting for you. The Founding Crop: Hemp, Empire, and the American Republic. The Jamestown colony, established in 1607, nearly failed 4 times in its first decade. It failed from disease, from conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy, from incompetent leadership, from a winter so deadly that colonists resorted to acts that the surviving records describe only obliquely. What kept it going, in part, was a series of commercial decisions made in London by the Virginia Company, which had invested considerable money in the venture and needed a return. Hemp was one of their solutions. The Virginia Assembly's mandate of 1619, that every household in the colony must grow hemp or face a fine, was an economic instrument, not an agricultural preference. England was spending enormous sums on hemp imported from Russia and the Baltic states. Every navy in Europe ran on hemp. A warship of the period required approximately 50 tons of hemp rope and hemp canvas to equip. The British fleet required so much hemp that a single year's supply represented a significant portion of the total trade flowing through certain Baltic ports. If Virginia could produce hemp domestically, the savings to the Crown would be substantial. The colonists complied, though without particular enthusiasm. Hemp was labour-intensive to process. The fibre had to be retted, which meant soaking the stalks in water until the outer material rotted away, leaving the useful inner fibre. The smell of retting hemp was extraordinary. A river bend set aside for hemp retting could be smelled from a considerable distance. The colonists, most of whom would have preferred to grow tobacco, which was more profitable and less unpleasant to process, grew hemp because they were required to. The medicinal properties of cannabis were known in colonial America, though they were discussed differently than they would be today. Cannabis tinctures and preparations appeared in the domestic medical literature of the 17th and 18th centuries under a variety of names. Nicholas Culpeper's Complete Herbal, published in London in 1653, and widely used by American colonists, listed hemp as a treatment for colic, casteth out and expelleth wind, and useful for burns when the seed was boiled in water and applied as a poultice. Culpeper was a botanist and physician, not a moralist, and his entry on hemp contains nothing that suggests the plant was regarded with any particular suspicion. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. This is a fact that has been repeated so often that it has acquired a slightly mythological quality, as if its repetition could summon a founding father endorsement of modern cannabis culture. The historical reality is more prosaic. Washington grew hemp for fibre, as most Virginia planters did, though his diary entries suggest that he was interested in cultivating plants with higher resin content. He notes, in one 1765 entry, that he had separated the male and female plants too late, which would have resulted in pollinated females and reduced resin production. What he intended to do with higher resin plants is not recorded. It may have been entirely practical. Resin has industrial uses. It may have been something else. The diary does not say. Thomas Jefferson also grew hemp. Benjamin Franklin's paper mill processed hemp fibre. The first 2 drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written on hemp paper. These facts are accurate, and they are also somewhat beside the point. They reflect a colonial economy in which hemp was a commodity crop, not a recreational substance or a cultural touchstone. The founding generation grew hemp the way they grew flax or barley. It was part of the agricultural landscape. What the founding generation also had access to, though this is less frequently discussed, was cannabis tincture as medicine. The 18th century American pharmacopoeia was drawn largely from European sources, and those sources included cannabis preparations for pain, for inflammation, for anxiety, for sleep. An American physician of the late 1700s encountering a patient with chronic pain would have had access to laudanum, which was tincture of opium in alcohol, and would also have had access to cannabis preparations. The choice between them was made on practical grounds, not on grounds of social acceptability. The industrial importance of hemp grew, if anything, during and after the Revolution. The Continental Army's supply needs were enormous, and hemp was essential to them. Rope, canvas, clothing, wagon covers, all of these required fibre, and hemp was the most reliable domestic source. Several states offered bounties for hemp production during the war years. Kentucky, which had begun significant hemp cultivation in the 1770s, became by the early 19th century the centre of a hemp industry that employed thousands of people and produced millions of pounds of fibre annually. By the mid-19th century, Kentucky hemp was competing successfully against imported hemp in the American market, and the crop was sufficiently important economically that it attracted the attention of agricultural reformers and government surveyors. The United States Patent Office, which in this period also functioned as a kind of agricultural development agency, published reports on hemp cultivation techniques, soil conditions and processing improvements. Hemp was not a fringe crop. It was a significant commercial agricultural product with its own political constituency, its own trade publications, and its own lobby in Washington. None of this commercial history had any particular connection to psychoactive use. The hemp grown for fibre in colonial and early American agriculture was processed in ways that destroyed or dispersed any resin content. The people who grew it were not doing so in order to smoke it. But the distinction between industrial hemp and psychoactive cannabis, a distinction that modern law would eventually encode in complicated and contested ways, was not one that 18th century American farmers needed to make. The question did not arise. The plant was what it was. You used the parts of it you needed. That innocence, if innocence is the right word for a state of affairs that involved enslaved labour doing much of the actual cultivation, would persist through the first 3/4 of the 19th century, and then, slowly, something shifted. A new form of cannabis arrived in American medicine, one that came not from farmers but from physicians, not from fields but from pharmacies. And it arrived precisely at the moment when American medicine was becoming something more systematic, more credentialed, and more commercially organised. The timing was, as it turned out, not coincidental. The specific geography of American hemp cultivation in the colonial period shaped where the industry would develop and what it would mean economically. Virginia's Tidewater region, where tobacco was the dominant crop, treated hemp as a regulatory burden. But the limestone-rich bluegrass country of what would become Kentucky proved extraordinarily well suited to hemp cultivation, and the families who settled that territory in the 1770s and 1780s found that it grew with a vigour that Virginia planters had not experienced. By 1800, Kentucky hemp was a significant commercial enterprise, and by 1850, the state was producing approximately 40,000 tons of hemp annually. The labour that grew and processed Kentucky hemp was primarily enslaved labour. This aspect of American hemp history is often omitted in accounts that focus on the Founding Fathers' agricultural practices, but it is essential to any honest understanding of the industry. The retting process, soaking hemp stalks in ponds or slow-moving streams to rot the outer material, was brutal work. Enslaved workers stood in water for hours, pulling sodden stalks, breathing the gas produced by bacterial decomposition. The breaking and scutching that followed, mechanically separating the useful fibre from the woody core, was similarly hard. Hemp barons in Kentucky built fortunes on this labour in ways that are directly comparable to the cotton fortunes of the Deep South. The relationship between American hemp and the Navy that the founding generation imagined themselves building was not incidental. Continental Navy vessels ran on hemp rigging. The strategic importance of domestic hemp supply was understood by military planners from the beginning of the Republic. During the War of 1812, when British naval blockades cut off much of America's access to imported goods, domestic hemp production became a genuine military priority, and the Kentucky industry expanded significantly in response. The connection between hemp and national defence was so well established that it would reappear more than a century later in the Second World War, when the federal government briefly reversed cannabis prohibition to encourage farmers to grow hemp for military purposes, a program called Hemp for Victory, complete with a promotional film, before re-prohibiting it immediately after the war ended. The medical dimension of colonial American cannabis use was modest but real. The domestic production of hemp for fibre meant that cannabis plant material was available in quantities that made experimentation possible, and some American physicians of the late 18th century were aware of European accounts of cannabis medicine even before O'Shaughnessy's 1839 paper brought it to wider attention. The herbalist guides that circulated in American households, simplified versions of the European herbals adapted for plants available in America, included hemp among the domestically available medicinal plants, generally recommending preparations of the seeds and leaves for digestive complaints. The transition from colonial hemp cultivation to the more medically sophisticated cannabis use of the 19th century was gradual and is difficult to trace precisely, because the categories involved, industrial hemp, medicinal cannabis, recreational use, were not cleanly distinguished in the period. What is clear is that by the 1820s and 1830s, as American medicine was becoming more formally organized, and as European medical literature was becoming more widely read in American cities, the idea of cannabis as a medical substance rather than merely a fiber plant was beginning to develop among American physicians. It is worth noting what the founding generation's relationship with cannabis was not. There is a persistent cultural mythology that Washington and Jefferson and their contemporaries were cannabis enthusiasts in a modern recreational sense, that their hemp growing reflected some kind of proto-progressive attitude toward drugs. This is almost entirely a projection backward from contemporary politics onto people who would have found the projection incomprehensible. They grew hemp because hemp was economically necessary, legally required in some periods, and militarily important. The psychoactive properties of the plant, if they were aware of them at all, were not a significant consideration. The mythology serves a rhetorical purpose in modern debates, but does not reflect historical reality. What does reflect historical reality is the uncomplicated relationship between colonial and early American society, and a plant that later generations would treat as profoundly dangerous. The danger was not discovered in the plant by later generations, it was projected onto it. The Doctor's Green Remedy, Cannabis in Victorian and Edwardian America. In 1839, a 30-year-old Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy published a paper in the Transactions of the Medical and Physical Society of Bengal that would, quietly and without fanfare, introduce cannabis medicine to the Western medical mainstream. O'Shaughnessy was working in Calcutta as a professor of chemistry at the Medical College of Bengal, and he had done what good colonial-era scientists sometimes did. He had paid serious attention to the medical practices of the people around him. He had observed cannabis being used by Indian physicians. He had read the available Sanskrit texts. He had then conducted a series of careful clinical trials on animals and eventually on human patients. His results were striking. Cannabis preparations dramatically relieved the muscle spasms of tetanus and rabies, diseases for which no other treatment of the period had any significant effect. He used it successfully in a case of infantile convulsions. He described its effects on pain, on appetite, on anxiety. His paper was rigorous, methodologically careful by the standards of the time, and written in the confident register of a physician who had observed things he could not explain but could not deny. The paper arrived in Britain at precisely the right moment. The British medical establishment was in the process of professionalising. The General Medical Council was established in 1858, creating for the first time a formal credentialing system for physicians, and there was considerable appetite for new remedies that could be backed by clinical observation rather than tradition. O'Shaughnessy's paper was translated into several European languages and discussed in medical journals on both sides of the Atlantic. Within a decade of its publication, cannabis tincture was being produced and sold by pharmaceutical companies in Britain and the United States. The American cannabis medicine market that developed in the second half of the 19th century was both larger and more chaotic than the British one. The American patent medicine industry, which was, in this period, essentially unregulated, produced cannabis preparations under dozens of brand names for dozens of conditions. Parke-Davis, one of the largest and most reputable pharmaceutical companies in the United States, sold a standardized cannabis tincture. Eli Lilly produced cannabis preparations. The Squibb Company made them. These were not disreputable fringe products. They were listed in medical catalogues, prescribed by physicians, and discussed in medical journals. The range of conditions for which cannabis was prescribed in this period is striking by any standard. Physicians used it for neuralgia, for migraine, for menstrual cramps, for insomnia, for anxiety, for the delirium tremens of alcohol withdrawal, for nausea, for appetite loss in tuberculosis patients, for the muscle spasms of multiple sclerosis, a condition that had been described but not yet named. The 1898 Merck Manual, one of the standard references for American physicians, listed cannabis among the treatments for conditions including hay fever, gout, and nervous debility. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds, wrote a widely cited 1890 paper for The Lancet in which he described cannabis as one of the most valuable medicines we possess for the treatment of certain kinds of neuralgia, migraine, and spasmodic conditions. Reynolds had used it in his own practice for 30 years and found it reliable. He noted that it required careful dosing. The effects varied considerably from patient to patient and from preparation to preparation, but that a practitioner who understood those variations had an extremely useful tool. Whether he prescribed it to the Queen specifically is not documented. The household medical records do not survive in complete form. The dosing problem was real and was widely discussed. Cannabis tinctures of the period were standardized only imperfectly. The potency of any given bottle depended on the quality of the plant material used, the extraction method, the age of the preparation, and the specific strain from which it was derived. A physician prescribing cannabis tincture in 1885 was working with considerably more uncertainty than a physician prescribing morphine, which by then was available in precise injectable doses. This practical disadvantage, rather than any concern about abuse or addiction, was the primary reason cannabis medicine began to lose ground to opiate preparations in the late 19th century. At the same time that physicians were questioning cannabis medicine's reliability, the patent medicine industry was using it in ways that made regulators increasingly uncomfortable. Cannabis was appearing in products sold directly to consumers without any medical supervision, soothing syrups, tonics, nervines, preparations for women's complaints. The phrase women's complaints covered an enormous range of conditions in the Victorian period, from menstrual pain to anxiety to the cluster of symptoms that physicians lumped under the label hysteria. Cannabis preparations were sold for all of these, sometimes alongside significant quantities of alcohol, morphine, or cocaine in the same bottle. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the first major federal legislation addressing the contents of medicines sold to Americans, required that products containing cannabis, among other substances, disclose this fact on their labels. It did not ban cannabis. It did not classify it as dangerous. It treated it the same way it treated morphine and cocaine, as something consumers deserved to know was in their medicine. This was a significant step toward regulation, but it was not prohibition, and it was not driven by a particular concern about cannabis, as opposed to any other active ingredient. By 1910, American medical practice had access to cannabis tinctures that had been refined over 70 years of clinical use, discussed in the major medical journals, and produced by the most reputable pharmaceutical companies in the country. The plant was in the official United States Pharmacopoeia. It was prescribed by mainstream physicians. It was used in hospitals. It was by any reasonable measure an accepted part of American medicine. Within 30 years, it would be illegal, and the reason for that shift would have almost nothing to do with medicine, and almost everything to do with a wave of immigration that American newspapers were describing in increasingly alarmed terms, and with one government official's very particular ideas about race and crime and the nature of danger. The physician who did more than any other single individual to establish cannabis medicine in the United States after O'Shaughnessy was a Kentucky-born doctor named John Bell, who in 1857 published an account of his clinical experiences with cannabis tincture in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, one of the most prestigious medical publications in the country. Bell had been experimenting with cannabis preparations in his neurological practice for several years and had found it consistently effective in certain types of migraine that did not respond to other available treatments. His paper triggered a wave of clinical reports from other physicians, and throughout the 1860s and 1870s, American medical journals carried regular accounts of cannabis being used for an expanding range of conditions. The Civil War had a complicated relationship with cannabis medicine. Morphine, which was available in injectable form after the development of the hypodermic needle in the 1850s, was the primary pain treatment used on the battlefield and in field hospitals, and the scale of its use during the war produced what physicians of the period called the army disease, opioid dependence in veterans who had been medicated with morphine during recovery from wounds. Cannabis tincture was used in some hospitals as an adjunct to morphine. physicians who were aware of both its pain-relieving and appetite-stimulating properties found it useful in managing soldiers whose recovery was complicated by inadequate nutrition. But the logistical challenges of field medicine meant that cannabis never achieved the prominence during the war that morphine did. The post-war period saw both the expansion of cannabis medicine and the first significant concerns about quality control. The problem was botanical. Cannabis plants grown in different climates, harvested at different stages of maturity, and processed with different techniques produced preparations of dramatically different potency. A tincture made from Indian cannabis might be 10 times as potent as one made from American-grown hemp. A physician who had calibrated dosing based on one supplier's product might find that a new batch from the same supplier, or from a different supplier, produced unexpected results, either inadequate effect or alarming overstimulation. The pharmacopoeia entries for cannabis, tincture acknowledged this problem but could not solve it without a reliable biological standardization method. Several pharmaceutical companies attempted to address the standardization problem through biological testing batches on animals to establish relative potency before releasing them to market. Parke-Davis developed a standardized cannabis fluid extract in the 1880s that was tested on dogs and frogs before release, and which the company marketed as a reliable product. Their promotional literature from the period is striking. It lists cannabis preparations as treatments for 14 specific conditions including neuralgia, migraine, and the insomnia caused by mental worry, and it describes the dosage in precise fractional terms, reflecting the company's confidence in their standardization process. The homeopathic medical tradition, which was a substantial and respectable part of American medicine in the 19th century, rather than the fringe practice it would later become, also incorporated cannabis extensively. Homeopathic physicians used highly diluted cannabis preparations for a range of conditions, and produced extensive clinical literature documenting their observations. The homeopathic provings of cannabis, systematic clinical trials in which the substance was given to healthy individuals and the resulting symptoms documented, produced detailed symptom pictures that homeopathic practitioners used to guide their prescribing for the next several decades. The women who used cannabis medicine in the 19th century, and there were many of them, since cannabis preparations for female complaints were among the most widely sold products in the patent medicine market, were not for the most part aware that they were using a substance that would later be described as having no accepted medical use. They were using what their physicians recommended or what the catalogues they ordered from promised would help. That the same substance would within a generation be portrayed as the drug of Mexican criminals and jazz musicians and moral degenerates was a transformation they would not have been able to anticipate, because nothing in their experience of it had prepared them for that characterization. The removal of cannabis from the United States Pharmacopoeia in 1942, 5 years after the Marijuana Tax Act made its legal handling nearly impossible, was a quiet administrative act whose significance was not apparent at the time to most physicians. The Pharmacopoeia was the official reference for drug standards and the legal definition of what counted as an accepted medicine. Once cannabis was no longer in it, the claim that cannabis had no accepted medical use became technically true in the circular sense that the removal of the drug from the official list of accepted medicines had created the very condition it described. Somewhere in this history there's a name or a moment that probably surprised you. If it hasn't put you to sleep yet, leave it below. If it has, it'll be there in the morning. The word that changed everything, how marijuana was invented. The word marijuana does not appear in American newspapers before approximately 1905. This is not because the plant was unknown, it is because the plant was known under different names: cannabis, hemp, Indian hemp, hashish, by the physicians and pharmacists who used and discussed it. The word marijuana came to the United States from Mexico, carried by Mexican immigrants who began arriving in the southwestern United States in larger numbers after 1910, when the Mexican Revolution disrupted the country and sent hundreds of thousands of people north across the border. What the immigrants brought with them was not a new substance. Cannabis had been part of Mexican popular culture for decades, particularly among the working class and the poor. Mexican soldiers had smoked it during the Revolution. It appeared in the corridors, the folk ballads that chronicle the war, and the name most commonly attached to it in that context was La Cucaracha, which appears in the famous revolutionary song. The verse about needing marijuana to walk refers to a soldier who cannot function without his cannabis. The song was probably funny to its original audience. It became, in American hands, evidence of something frightening. The crucial mechanism by which cannabis became marijuana, and marijuana became dangerous, was the newspaper. American print journalism in the 1910s and 1920s was not a particularly scrupulous institution. The traditions of yellow journalism that William Randolph Hearst had made dominant in the 1890s had somewhat subsided but had not disappeared, and in the border states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, newspapers were eager for stories that reflected the anxieties of their largely white readership about the changing demographics of their communities. Mexican immigrants became, in the newspaper coverage of this period, the face of a drug crisis that journalists were in the process of inventing. Stories appeared claiming that Mexican men who smoked marijuana became violent, sexually aggressive, and impervious to pain. Stories claimed that a Mexican man could be shot multiple times while under the influence of marijuana and would not feel it, would continue the attack, would not stop. Stories appeared in New Orleans newspapers, a city with a significant Mexican and Caribbean population, claiming that marijuana use was spreading to black communities and from there to white communities, that white women were in danger. None of these stories were substantiated. Many were fabricated entirely, but they served a purpose. They attached the name marijuana, the Mexican word, foreign-sounding, unfamiliar, to a set of fears that had very little to do with the plant and a great deal to do with the people associated with it. The strategy was not new. It was a variation on the same approach that had been used to associate opium with Chinese immigrants in the previous generation and cocaine with black men in the South. In each case, a drug that white Americans also used extensively was rebranded as the particular intoxicant of a racial or ethnic group, and then the drug itself was used as a proxy for anxiety about that group. Harry Jacob Anslinger noticed the newspapers. He noticed them, filed them, and used them. Anslinger had become the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, a position that required justifying its own existence at a moment when the federal government was being asked to cut spending because of the Depression. Anslinger had built his career in prohibition enforcement, and when prohibition ended in 1933, he needed a new drug to prohibit. Cannabis was available. Anslinger began building a case against it. He solicited reports from state and local law enforcement agencies across the country, asking for examples of crimes committed under the influence of marijuana. He received thousands of responses. Many reported that marijuana did not appear to cause violence among users in their jurisdictions. Anslinger ignored these. He collected the ones that made useful reading, crimes reported, sometimes without verification, to have been committed by marijuana users, and assembled them into a file he called the Gore File. The Gore File became the evidentiary basis for Anslinger's public crusade. He fed stories from it to newspapers, who published them under headlines of escalating alarm. He gave speeches to civic organizations. He wrote articles for magazines, including the American Magazine, where his 1937 piece Marijuana, Assassin of Youth described in graphic detail the crimes supposedly committed by young people under the influence, crimes that, when researchers later investigated them, often turned out to be unverified, misattributed, or entirely fabricated. The word marijuana was itself a strategic choice. Cannabis, Indian hemp, hashish. These were words that physicians used, that pharmacists used, that appeared in medical literature that members of Congress might have read. Marijuana sounded foreign. It sounded threatening. It sounded like the word of people who were themselves being portrayed as threatening. Anslinger understood that what a thing was called shaped what people thought it was, and he consistently referred to the plant by its Mexican immigrant name rather than its medical one. In 1936, the propaganda film Reefer Madness was produced, initially as a cautionary film funded by a church group, later acquired and distributed by Dwayne Esper as exploitation entertainment. The film depicted teenagers driven to murder, suicide, and sexual assault after smoking cannabis. It was not a government production, but it reflected and amplified precisely the narrative that Anslinger had been building for years. When it was released, Anslinger's campaign was already well advanced. The film found an audience that had been primed to believe it. What was being prohibited in the hysteria of the mid-1930s was not primarily a pharmacological substance. It was an association, the association of a plant with people that a significant portion of the American public had been taught to fear. The plant itself, the one that physicians had been prescribing for decades, the one that appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the one that had been in continuous medical use since O'Shaughnessy's paper in 1839, that plant was a casualty of a much larger political battle. It simply had the misfortune of being associated, at this particular historical moment, with the wrong people. The specific communities in which cannabis smoking arrived in the United States in the early 20th century were concentrated in port cities and border towns. New Orleans, with its Caribbean trade connections and large Creole population, had a cannabis culture that predated the Mexican immigration wave. Sailors and dock workers had brought cannabis smoking traditions from Caribbean ports, and the French Quarter's nightlife included establishments where cannabis was available alongside alcohol well before the Mexican Revolution sent waves of immigration northward. The jazz scene that would come to be associated with cannabis in the popular imagination was not inventing a new practice, it was inheriting an existing one. The New Orleans newspaper reporting on cannabis in the 1910s is instructive in its method. Stories would appear claiming that cannabis-crazed men, the men in these stories were almost always black or Mexican, had committed acts of violence that only the supernatural resistance to pain produced by the drug could explain. The violence was always extreme. The supposed insensibility to pain was always stressed. And the writers never, in these accounts, interviewed users or physicians or anyone who might have complicated the narrative with actual observations about what cannabis use looked like in practice. They were writing about a creature they had largely imagined. Harry Anslinger's relationship with the press was systematic and deliberate. He maintained ongoing relationships with editors and reporters at newspapers across the country, providing them with stories from his gore file, suggesting angles following up on coverage. He was, by any modern standard, a sophisticated media operator. The campaign he ran against cannabis was not a series of spontaneous public warnings. It was a coordinated communication strategy designed to produce specific legislative outcomes. When the Marijuana Tax Act came before Congress, the members of that Congress had been reading newspaper accounts of cannabis-related violence for years. They had been prepared. The racial logic of the anti-cannabis campaign was not incidental to it. Anslinger's private correspondence, which became available to researchers after his death and after Freedom of Information requests cleared certain bureau records, makes his racial attitudes explicit in terms that would have been professionally damaging even by the standards of 1930s America if expressed publicly. He used terms for Black Americans and Mexican Americans that were, even then, considered extreme. His targeting of jazz musicians was openly racialized. He did not, for example, conduct the same systematic investigation of cannabis use among white country musicians, though cannabis was used in that community as well. The effect of the marijuana is Mexican framing extended beyond the immediate legislative campaign. By attaching the substance so thoroughly to a specific immigrant community, Anslinger and the newspapers that repeated his narrative created a cognitive association that proved extremely durable. Decades after the Mexican immigration wave had subsided as a political issue, the association between cannabis and racial otherness persisted, and it shaped enforcement patterns in ways that survey data would consistently confirm. Cannabis users in predominantly Black and Latino communities face significantly higher arrest rates than cannabis users in predominantly white communities, even when use rates were comparable. The film industry's contribution to the moral panic about cannabis is somewhat better remembered than the newspaper campaigns that preceded it, largely because reefer madness has had an afterlife as a cult object, screened at midnight showings, sold as a curiosity, used by cannabis advocates as evidence of the absurdity of prohibition rhetoric. But its cultural moment was genuinely frightening for some audiences. The film arrived in communities where the newspaper coverage Anslinger had seeded had been running for years, and it gave visual form to fears that had been elaborated in print. The teenagers in the film looked like the teenagers in the audience's families. That was the point. What none of the anti-cannabis propaganda addressed, because addressing it would have undermined the campaign, was the existing medical literature. The physicians who had been prescribing cannabis for decades, the pharmacopoeia that listed it, the pharmaceutical companies that produced it, the hospitals that used it. These were inconvenient realities that the propaganda campaign simply ignored. The success of that ignoring is itself historically significant. The erasure of a substantial body of clinical knowledge from public consciousness, accomplished through the machinery of newspaper coverage and congressional testimony within a period of roughly a decade, represents a kind of managed forgetting whose mechanisms are worth studying carefully. The tax that was never about tax, the making of federal prohibition. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was not technically a prohibition. It was a tax. This distinction was not accidental. The Supreme Court had already established, in the 1919 Webb v. United States decision concerning the Harrison Narcotics Act, that Congress could regulate drugs through taxation. Direct federal criminalization of a substance was constitutionally murkier, so the architects of the 1937 Act did what the architects of the Harrison Act had done. They taxed the substance in a way that made legal commerce in it effectively impossible, while using the administrative structure of the tax to license and monitor anyone who wished to legally handle it. The tax was $1 per ounce for registered dealers and $100 per ounce for unregistered ones. $100 in 1937 was approximately $2,000 in modern terms. Unregistered possession or transfer was a criminal offence. The practical effect was prohibition. The legal architecture was taxation. This distinction allowed the Act to pass constitutional muster while achieving exactly what a straightforward ban would have achieved. The congressional hearings on the Marijuana Tax Act were held in the spring of 1937. They lasted 2 days. Anslinger presented his case in the morning of the first day, citing statistics and newspaper clippings from his Gore file. Several witnesses testified in support of the Act, largely repeating the claims that Anslinger had been circulating for years. The opposition was thin. The American Medical Association appeared, represented by its legislative counsel, Dr. William C. Woodward. Woodward's testimony was remarkable, and remarkably ineffective. He told the committee that the AMA had only recently learned that the marijuana they were being asked to prohibit was the same plant as the cannabis that appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia, and that had been a standard medical preparation for decades. He argued that the AMA had not been properly consulted. He pointed out that the evidence for cannabis causing violence was unsubstantiated. He noted that prohibition would cut off ongoing research into the plant's medical applications, which was still being actively studied. The committee was not interested. Representative John Coffey of Washington told Woodward bluntly that the hearing had already heard enough testimony, and that if the AMA did not have any better information to offer than what had already been presented, they could leave. The exchange was not heated. It was dismissive. Woodward left. The Act proceeded. What the committee did not hear, and what would not become publicly known for many years, was the internal assessment of the Treasury Department's own scientific advisor, Dr. James Munch, who had told the department prior to the hearings that cannabis did not cause the violence that Anslinger was claiming. This assessment was not presented to Congress. Munch appeared at the hearings and testified to a dramatically different effect, at one point claiming that he had personally tested marijuana on dogs, and that, on one occasion, he himself had consumed it, and it had caused him to think he was a bat. This testimony was accepted without apparent skepticism by the committee. The Marijuana Tax Act passed with minimal congressional debate. President Roosevelt signed it in August 1937. In the months that followed, cannabis tincture disappeared from pharmacy shelves. It was removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia in 1942. Decades of medical knowledge about its applications were effectively paused. Physicians who had been using cannabis preparations in their practice were left without a legal supply. Researchers who wanted to study it were required to navigate a tax structure so burdensome that most simply did not bother. Anslinger's Federal Bureau of Narcotics did not rest after the Act's passage. He had built an institutional identity around drug enforcement, and that identity required ongoing threats to justify ongoing budgets. He continued prosecuting cannabis cases with considerable vigour through the 1940s and 1950s, and he continued shaping public perception of the drug through media relationships that by modern standards would constitute something approaching propaganda coordination. One aspect of Anslinger's campaign that was not widely known during his lifetime involved jazz. Anslinger was open in private correspondence, letters that became available to researchers after his death, about his belief that cannabis was particularly associated with black jazz musicians, whom he despised on racial grounds that he expressed with considerable candour in those letters. He initiated investigations of specific musicians he suspected of cannabis use. Billie Holiday was a target of his investigations, though the primary substance she struggled with was heroin. He maintained surveillance files on musicians including Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and others. The jazz world's relationship with cannabis was real. It was widely used in that community. But the intensity of Anslinger's focus on it was shaped by his racial attitudes as much as his law enforcement mandate. The academic and medical community's response to all of this was largely muted through the 1940s and early 1950s. One significant exception was the LaGuardia Committee report, commissioned by New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia in 1938 and completed in 1944. The committee, composed of physicians, psychiatrists, and other experts, conducted the most rigorous scientific study of cannabis use that had been undertaken in the United States to that point. Their conclusions were clear. Marijuana did not cause violence, did not lead inevitably to harder drug use, was not a major social problem in the ways Anslinger had claimed. Anslinger publicly attacked the report as unscientific and made it a professional liability to be associated with it. The New York Academy of Medicine, which had supported the committee, withdrew from controversy. The report was largely forgotten. By the mid-1950s, Anslinger had achieved something that few government officials ever manage: the wholesale transformation of public perception about a substance that had been in continuous and largely uncontroversial use for the entirety of the nation's existence. He had done it with clippings from newspapers, with the testimony of a man who thought marijuana had turned him into a bat, and with a 2-day congressional hearing in which the only physician who raised serious objections was dismissed before he finished his testimony. It was one of the more effective bureaucratic operations in American history. The industrial hemp lobby that had existed since the colonial period had, by the 1930s, a significant financial interest in the cannabis plant that was distinct from and largely unconnected to the question of psychoactive use. Hemp fiber remained commercially important. Hemp seed oil had industrial applications. Several significant American businesses, including the DuPont Chemical Company and the Hearst newspaper empire, had commercial interests that were affected by hemp's legal status, though in ways that historians have debated at length. The claim that DuPont lobbied for cannabis prohibition to protect its synthetic fiber patents, or that Hearst supported prohibition to protect his timber interests from hemp paper competition, has been asserted by cannabis advocates for decades and disputed by historians who find the documentary evidence for these specific motivations thin. What is documented is that the hemp industry's opposition to the Marijuana Tax Act was not effectively organized. The distinctions between industrial hemp and psychoactive cannabis that would later be encoded in law were not clearly made in 1937, and the industrial hemp producers who might have mounted an effective opposition campaign largely failed to engage until the legislation was effectively decided. This failure of organization reflected the broader pattern. Those who had the most to gain from opposing prohibition were the least prepared to make the case. The American pharmaceutical industry's response to the act, beyond the AMA's ineffective congressional testimony, was muted. Park Davis, Eli Lilly, Squibb, and the other companies that had been producing cannabis preparations simply discontinued their cannabis product lines and moved on to other remedies. The market for cannabis medicines was not, by 1937, their largest or most profitable product category. The sulfonamide antibiotics had recently arrived, and pharmaceutical companies were rapidly pivoting to the new paradigm of synthetic and semi-synthetic medicines that would define the mid-20th century pharmacological revolution. Cannabis tincture, with its dosing unreliability and its new legal complications, was relatively easy to discontinue. The consequences for patients were less easy to manage. The physicians who had been using cannabis preparations for migraine, for multiple sclerosis, for anxiety, for menstrual pain, for the nausea of pregnancy, were now without a legal supply of a medicine that had been working for their patients. They did not, in most cases, have equivalently effective alternatives for all of these conditions. The history of what those patients then experienced, the conditions they continued to have, the medicines they were offered instead, the outcomes, and was not studied. No one was keeping track. The period between 1937 and the 1960s was one in which cannabis essentially disappeared from mainstream American public life, though not from the lives of people who sought it out. Jazz musicians continued using it. Mexican and Caribbean immigrant communities continued using it. In the early 1950s, with the emergence of the Beat Generation literary movement, cannabis use spread into a small but culturally significant white bohemian counterculture. Poet Allen Ginsberg smoked cannabis. Jack Kerouac described it in On the Road. The Beat's association with cannabis gave it a new cultural valence. Not dangerous criminality exactly, but transgression, creativity, rejection of conformity. Anslinger watched this development with alarm. He had spent 20 years building an image of cannabis as the drug of racial minorities and criminal elements. The Beats were not criminals in any conventional sense, and several of them were white. Their embrace of cannabis complicated the racial framing that had been so central to his campaign. His response was to add a new element to the cannabis narrative. It was now also the drug of communists and subversives, of people who rejected American values. The Cold War context gave him a new vocabulary of threat to layer onto the racial one. Cannabis was not simply dangerous, it was un-American. This Cold War dimension of anti-cannabis politics is less well remembered than the earlier racial framing, but was significant in shaping the mid-century understanding of the drug among mainstream Americans. The association of cannabis with political dissent, with people who opposed the government, opposed the war, opposed conventional social arrangements, was a powerful mechanism for keeping moderate, patriotic Americans away from it. It also meant that when the 1960s counterculture adopted cannabis as a symbol of generational rebellion, they were, however, inadvertently accepting a framing that their opponents had deliberately created. The commission that was never going to matter, Nixon and the War on Drugs. In 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which replaced the patchwork of existing federal drug laws with a single comprehensive scheduling system. Drugs were classified into 5 schedules based on their medical utility and potential for abuse. Schedule 1 was reserved for substances with no accepted medical use and high abuse potential. Schedule 2 contained substances with medical use but high abuse potential. Cocaine was Schedule 2. Methamphetamine was Schedule 2. Fentanyl was Schedule 2. Cannabis was placed in Schedule 1 provisionally, with the understanding that this was a temporary classification pending the conclusions of a National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse that Nixon had appointed under the Act. The commission was chaired by former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer and was charged with conducting a comprehensive scientific and social review of cannabis and reporting back to Congress. Nixon had reason to believe the commission would give him the answer he wanted. He had appointed it. Schaefer was a Republican. The commission's membership included law enforcement figures alongside scientists and physicians. But the commission did what good commissions sometimes do. It followed the evidence. The Schaefer Commission report, published in March 1972, was titled Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding. Its principal recommendation was decriminalization of cannabis for personal use. The commission found that the evidence for cannabis causing violence was unsubstantiated, a conclusion that echoed the LaGuardia Committee of 1944, which Anslinger had suppressed. It found that the evidence for cannabis as a gateway drug leading to harder drug use was weak and inconsistent. It found that the harms of prohibition, the criminalization of users, the racial disparities in enforcement, the cost to the justice system, exceeded the harms attributable to cannabis itself. Nixon rejected the report before it was published. A White House aide named John Dean later testified that Nixon had telephoned Schaefer prior to the report's release and expressed his displeasure in unmistakable terms. Nixon did not want decriminalization. He wanted a war. What Nixon wanted, as would become clear from the White House tape recordings made public through the Watergate proceedings, was a drug war that served political purposes. The recordings include a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, in which Nixon says, with startling directness, that the anti-war left and black people were his political enemies, and that by associating both groups with drugs and then criminalizing drugs, his administration could disrupt those communities without directly targeting them. Did you know, Nixon asks in one recording, that it is far more dangerous to give drugs to a white person than to a Harlem Negro? The question is rhetorical in its form. The belief it reflects is not. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, confirmed this interpretation in a 1994 interview with journalist Dan Baum that Baum did not publish until 2016. Ehrlichman said, The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. The Schedule 1 classification for cannabis that Nixon made permanent in the wake of the Schaefer Commission report was, by Ehrlichman's account, not a pharmacological judgment. It was a political weapon. The scheduling system that would govern cannabis for the next 50-plus years, a system that made it legally equivalent to heroin and more restricted than cocaine, was built on a foundation that its own architects acknowledged, privately, was not about the drug at all. The Controlled Substances Act also created the Drug Enforcement Administration, which absorbed and replaced the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and gave federal drug enforcement considerably more resources and authority than it had previously had. The DEA's budget in 1973, its first year of operation, was approximately $75 million. By 1975, it was over $200 million. The institutional logic was now fully established. More drug crime meant more resources for drug enforcement, which meant more drug crime had to be found. Cannabis, with its millions of users, was an inexhaustible source of arrests. The racial disparities in cannabis enforcement that would become one of the most documented features of the war on drugs were visible almost from the beginning. Studies in multiple cities during the 1970s found that black cannabis users were significantly more likely to be arrested for possession than white cannabis users, even in communities where survey data suggested comparable or higher rates of use among white populations. This pattern was not incidental to the war on drugs. According to the people who designed it, it was the point. By the late 1970s, cannabis prohibition was a fully mature institutional system with its own bureaucracies, its own budgets, its own political coalitions, its own legal infrastructure, and its own rhetoric. It had produced, within a single generation, the transformation of a crop that colonial Virginians had been legally required to grow into a Schedule I controlled substance whose possession could result in federal prison sentences. The distance between those 2 points is a measure not of the plant's changing nature but of the changing uses to which political power had put it. The 1960s transformation of cannabis from marginal bohemian substance to mass-market youth phenomenon was one of the more remarkable drug cultural shifts in American history. It happened within roughly a decade, driven by the intersection of several forces, the baby boom generation coming of age in enormous numbers, the Vietnam War and the political radicalization it produced, the counterculture and its deliberate rejection of mainstream norms, and the simple fact that cannabis was significantly less dangerous, in immediate physiological terms, than alcohol, which the same generation's parents had been legally consuming for their entire adult lives. The numbers were striking and well documented by the time Nixon took office. A 1969 Gallup poll found that approximately 22 million Americans had tried cannabis. By 1972, the year of the Schaefer Commission report, the number was estimated at over 24 million. These were not marginal populations, they were college students, veterans returning from Vietnam, young professionals. They were, increasingly, the children of exactly the kind of middle-class Americans whose support Nixon needed for any sustained drug enforcement campaign. This demographic reality complicated the politics of prohibition in ways that Anslinger had never had to manage. When cannabis users were, in public perception, Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, prosecution was easy to justify to a white middle-class audience. When cannabis users were, in fact, that audience's children, the political calculus became more complex. Nixon's solution, the solution reflected in the tapes and confirmed by Ehrlichman, was to maintain the rhetoric of drug danger while quietly accepting that prosecution of middle-class white users would be politically damaging, and to concentrate enforcement on the communities where it was politically safe. The mandatory minimum sentences that Congress enacted in the 1970s, first through the Controlled Substances Act and then through subsequent legislation, created an enforcement system whose racial disparities were not accidental. Crack cocaine, which was more common in black urban communities, carried penalties 100 times more severe than powder cocaine, more common in white communities, for the same weight of the substance. cannabis possession penalties, while theoretically race-neutral, were applied in practice in ways that reflected and amplified existing racial inequities in policing. A young black man arrested for cannabis possession in Baltimore faced a dramatically different legal trajectory than a white college student arrested for the same possession in a suburban campus context. The Schaefer Commission's 1972 recommendation of decriminalization did not vanish entirely. 11 states, including Oregon, California, and New York, decriminalized cannabis possession in some form during the 1970s. The Carter administration briefly raised the possibility of federal decriminalization. A White House drug policy advisor named Peter Bourne was a vocal advocate for cannabis decriminalization and had access to the president. Then, in 1978, Bourne was photographed at a party where cannabis was present, and the subsequent political fallout effectively ended the federal decriminalization conversation for more than a decade. The 1980s brought the Reagan administration and the escalation of the war on drugs into something even more institutionally comprehensive than what Nixon had built. Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign was directed primarily at youth and focused on a set of narratives about drug use and peer pressure that had almost no connection to the research literature on why adolescents use drugs and what interventions were effective in changing that behavior. The campaign was evaluated in multiple studies over the following years and found, consistently, to have had no measurable effect on drug use rates. It was enormously visible. It generated extensive media coverage. It produced a line of branded merchandise. It did not reduce drug use. The Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, DARE, was launched in Los Angeles in 1983 and spread to school systems across the country through the late 1980s and 1990s. Its program of police officers presenting anti-drug curricula to elementary school children was evaluated in multiple independent studies over its first 2 decades of operation and found, repeatedly, to have no significant effect on drug use rates among participants. Some studies suggested modest increases in drug curiosity. The Department of Justice's own research wing concluded in 2003 that the program was ineffective. DARE continued operating. The specific legal mechanics by which the Nixon administration made the Schedule I designation permanent after rejecting the Schaefer Commission are worth understanding. The Controlled Substances Act gave the Attorney General authority to schedule substances based on findings from the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, meaning that the scientific determination of a substance's appropriate schedule was supposed to be led by health officials rather than law enforcement. In practice, the process by which cannabis was left in Schedule I after 1972 involved a series of administrative decisions, judicial deference to agency expertise, and periodic rescheduling petitions from advocacy groups that the DEA consistently denied. The first formal rescheduling petition after the Schaefer Commission was filed in 1972 by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. The DEA did not respond for 13 years. When it finally conducted hearings on the petition in 1986, its own administrative law judge, Francis Young, concluded in a 1988 ruling that cannabis in its natural form was one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man, and that it met the legal standard for accepted medical use. The DEA administrator rejected Judge Young's ruling and kept cannabis in Schedule I. The DEA's position was that the scientific evidence for medical use, however compelling it appeared to the judge, did not meet the agency's own more stringent standard of large-scale randomized controlled trials, a standard that, given the regulatory obstacles to conducting such trials with Schedule I substances, was essentially impossible to satisfy. This circularity, you cannot reschedule because there are no clinical trials, and you cannot conduct clinical trials because the substance is scheduled, was identified by researchers, physicians, and legal scholars as a fundamental problem with the scheduling system's application to cannabis. It was not resolved by any administrative or legislative action in the 20th century. It was instead managed by state-level actions that accumulated over 2 decades until the federal position became, in practical terms, untenable. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Tin Boxes, AIDS, Cancer, and the government's secret marijuana program. In 1976, a Washington, D.C. glaucoma patient named Robert Randall was arrested for growing cannabis plants on the porch of his apartment. Randall did not deny growing the plants. His defense was that he needed them. He had been diagnosed with glaucoma in his mid-20s and told by his physicians that he would be blind within 5 years. Standard glaucoma treatments of the period were insufficient to control his intraocular pressure. Cannabis, Randall had discovered through what he described as accidental experimentation, reduced his eye pressure significantly and reliably. Without it, he lost his vision. With it, he maintained it. Randall's defense was medical necessity. His legal team argued that he had no reasonable alternative, that the choice was between breaking the law and going blind, and that this constituted a valid defense under existing legal principles. The court agreed. Randall was acquitted, and then, in the aftermath of his acquittal, he filed a request with the federal government to receive cannabis legally through a program that very few people knew existed. The Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program, Compassionate IND, had been established in 1978 as a narrow pathway through which patients with conditions unresponsive to other treatments could receive cannabis supplied by the federal government. The cannabis was grown at the University of Mississippi under a contract with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, rolled into cigarettes, and shipped in tin canisters to participating patients. The program was small, bureaucratically cumbersome, and not publicly advertised. Randall became its first approved patient. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, the program remained small. Applications had to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the treating physician. Each of these institutions had the ability to slow or block an application. Most did. The few patients who navigated the process successfully received their tin canisters of federal cannabis every month and were required to participate in ongoing research as a condition of their supply. Some found the arrangement adequate. Others found the quality of the federal cannabis, which was grown with fiber yield rather than potency in mind, disappointing. The cigarettes were distinctive looking, pre-rolled and institutional, quite different from what was available on the street. Then the AIDS epidemic changed everything. By the late 1980s, AIDS was killing tens of thousands of Americans, primarily gay men, and the treatments available, most notably the antiretroviral drug AZT, produced side effects that were themselves sometimes devastating. One of the most common and debilitating consequences of both AIDS itself and the medications used to treat it was wasting syndrome, a severe and progressive loss of appetite and weight that left patients unable to eat, unable to maintain body mass, and unable to sustain the caloric intake necessary for any quality of life. Cannabis was known to stimulate appetite. This had been documented clinically since the 1970s. Patients on chemotherapy, another population experiencing severe nausea and appetite loss, had been quietly using cannabis to maintain the ability to eat, and the relief it provided was documented in the medical literature with enough consistency that it could not be ignored. When AIDS patients began seeking legal access to cannabis through the Compassionate IND program, the number of applications increased dramatically. By 1991, the program had approved approximately 30 patients and had a backlog of more than 1,000 applications. The Bush administration's response in 1992 was to close the program. New applications were suspended. The stated reason was that an expanded medical cannabis program sent the wrong message during an ongoing effort to discourage drug use. The approximately 15 patients then actively receiving federal cannabis were grandfathered in and continued to receive their monthly tin canisters for the rest of their lives. The 1,000 or more people who had applications pending were told to find another solution. The closure of the Compassionate IND program produced an immediate and galvanizing effect on AIDS activist communities. Organizations like ACT UP, which had already developed sophisticated strategies for confronting government inaction on AIDS, made medical cannabis access one of their issues. San Francisco, which had the largest concentrated AIDS patient population of any American city outside New York, became the center of an underground network of buyers' clubs, organizations that obtained cannabis and distributed it to patients who needed it, in deliberate defiance of state and federal law. Dennis Perron was a San Francisco activist and cannabis dealer who had been a vocal advocate for medical cannabis since the early 1980s, when he had watched his partner Jonathan West die of AIDS. West had used cannabis to manage his appetite loss and nausea in the final years of his life, and Perron had witnessed what he described as the difference it made in those years' quality. He opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club in 1991, operating openly, serving thousands of patients, and daring local law enforcement to close him down. They did, eventually. He kept opening. Brownie Mary was a San Francisco hospital volunteer named Mary Jane Rathbun, who in the late 1980s and early 1990s baked marijuana brownies in her apartment and brought them to AIDS patients in San Francisco General Hospital. She was in her 70s. She was arrested in 1981 for possession, with intent to distribute after police found a large quantity of marijuana and baking supplies at her home. The prosecutor declined to press charges. When she was arrested again in 1992, the response from the AIDS patient community and from ordinary San Franciscans was one of such intensity. The sight of a 70-year-old grandmother being prosecuted for bringing cookies to dying men had a clarifying effect on public opinion, that it contributed directly to the momentum that would produce California's Proposition 215 years later. The federal government's response to all of this was to prosecute. The DEA raided buyers' clubs. State and federal prosecutors indicted distributors. The Department of Justice maintained that there was no recognized medical use for cannabis, a position required by its Schedule I classification, even as 15 patients were receiving monthly shipments of federal cannabis in tin canisters from a government warehouse in Mississippi. The contradiction was not acknowledged officially. It was simply held in parallel with the official position, in the particular way that government departments sometimes hold contradictory policies without either resolving or discussing the tension. The compassionate IND program surviving patients, the 15 individuals who continued receiving federal cannabis after the 1992 closure, became, by the late 1990s, a peculiar and largely ignored counterargument to the official federal position on cannabis's medical utility. Each month they received their tin canisters. Each month they took their medicine. Several of them were interviewed by journalists over the years, and those interviews have a quietly surreal quality. People describing the experience of receiving a federally prohibited substance in the mail, in government-rolled cigarettes, from a university research farm, while the same government was prosecuting thousands of other people for possessing the same substance. Irvin Rosenfeld was one of the surviving compassionate IND patients. He had a rare bone disorder called multiple congenital cartilaginous exostoses, which caused bony tumours to grow on his skeleton. He had been enrolled in the program in 1982, after demonstrating that cannabis significantly slowed the growth of his tumours. When he was interviewed in the 2000s, he estimated that he had smoked more federal cannabis cigarettes than any other person in history. He described them as low quality. The federal cannabis was grown for consistency and research purposes, rather than for clinical efficacy, and its THC content was relatively low. He smoked more of them than he would have needed of a higher potency preparation. The federal government's own cannabis program was, in his assessment, not the best cannabis available, but it was the only legal cannabis available, and it worked well enough. The AIDS epidemic's particular relationship with cannabis produced one of the more carefully documented bodies of evidence about the plant's medical utility available at the time. Oncologist Donald Abrams at the University of California, San Francisco, spent years in the 1980s and early 1990s trying to conduct a clinical trial of cannabis for AIDS-related weight loss. His first application to the National Institute on Drug Abuse for research-grade cannabis was denied in 1992, the same year the federal government closed the Compassionate IND program. The denial letter cited concerns about setting precedent. A subsequent application, redesigned to address specific NIH concerns, was approved in 1997, making Abrams' study the first FDA-approved clinical trial of smoked cannabis in a generation. The results, published in 2000, showed that cannabis significantly increased caloric intake and body weight in AIDS patients, a finding that confirmed what patients had been reporting informally for years. The suffering of AIDS patients during the years when the Compassionate IND program was closed and formal research was blocked has not been quantified in any systematic way. The number of people who experienced wasting syndrome without effective appetite stimulation, the number who lost the ability to eat and maintain body weight during years when their disease was itself eventually manageable through antiretroviral medication. These are not figures that appear in any official accounting. They are part of what historians call a counterfactual, a calculation of harm that policy produced but that does not appear in the ledger, because the harm was absence rather than action. The buyers' clubs that operated in San Francisco and New York and other cities in the early 1990s were not, for the most part, run by people who thought of themselves as political actors. They were run by people who had watched friends die and who had concluded that the available official options were inadequate. Mary Jane Rathbun, Brownie Mary, was not a political philosopher. She was a retired hospital worker who baked. Her arrest and its political fallout were not the result of a calculated advocacy strategy. They were the result of a 70-something woman baking cookies in her kitchen and bringing them to men who were dying, and the spectacle of that woman being arrested was something that a sufficient number of ordinary San Franciscans found intolerable. The network of people who provided cannabis to AIDS patients in this period operated at real legal risk. State law in California remained in force, and state law followed federal classification. Distributors could be, and were, prosecuted. Several served prison sentences. The moral weight of those sentences, people imprisoned for providing appetite stimulation to dying patients, did not go unnoticed among advocates, and it contributed to the emotional temperature of the Proposition 215 campaign several years later. What the AIDS crisis revealed, among other things, was the extent to which the prohibition of cannabis as medicine was costing identifiable people their quality of life and potentially their lives. This was different from the earlier arguments about cannabis prohibition. The earlier arguments had been largely structural, about racial justice, about civil liberties, about the inconsistency between cannabis's legal status and its actual danger profile. The AIDS argument was immediate and personal. These are specific people dying in specific ways, for whom this specific medicine provides specific relief, and the government is preventing them from having it. That argument proved eventually harder to ignore. The California Revolt, how the states began taking the plant back. Proposition 215, the California Compassionate Use Act, appeared on the state ballot in November 1996. It passed with 56% of the vote. It was the first successful state medical cannabis initiative in American history, and it created an immediate and unresolved conflict between state and federal law. A conflict that the federal government initially attempted to resolve through prosecution, and that eventually resolved itself over the following 2 decades in the state's favour. The campaign for Proposition 215 was unusual in California political history, because it was driven not primarily by professional political organisations or major donors, but by a coalition of dying patients, their caregivers, and activists who had been radicalised by the AIDS crisis. Dennis Peron, whose Cannabis Buyers Club had been raided and closed by state authorities the previous year, wrote the initiative largely himself. The language was deliberately patient-centred. It did not attempt to legalise recreational cannabis, only to create a medical exemption for patients with serious illnesses. The federal government's response to Proposition 215's passage was swift and legally aggressive. The Clinton administration convened a meeting of the nation's federal prosecutors within weeks of the election and instructed them that federal law preempted state law on cannabis, and that physicians who recommended cannabis to patients could face federal prosecution or the loss of their DEA prescribing licenses. This threat was significant. A physician who lost their DEA license could not prescribe any controlled substance, which was a career-ending outcome for most practitioners. A group of physicians sued. The resulting case, Conant versus Walters, made its way through the federal courts, and in 2002 the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the federal government could not prosecute physicians simply for discussing cannabis with patients, that doing so violated the First Amendment right to free speech between a doctor and a patient. The government could prohibit physicians from writing cannabis prescriptions. It could not prohibit them from talking. This distinction created the curious legal category of the cannabis recommendation, a physician statement that a patient might benefit from cannabis, which carefully avoided the language of prescription that became the foundation of state medical cannabis systems nationwide. Other states were watching California. In 1998, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington passed medical cannabis initiatives on the same November ballot. Nevada and Maine followed in 2000. Hawaii became the first state to pass medical cannabis through its legislature rather than through a ballot initiative in 2000. Each state's law was slightly different. Different qualifying conditions, different possession limits, different dispensary structures. and each created its own version of the conflict with federal law. The Supreme Court addressed this conflict directly in Gonzalez v. Reich in 2005, in a case that became one of the most discussed Commerce Clause decisions in decades. Angel Reich was a California patient who used cannabis, recommended by her physician for a cluster of serious medical conditions, including an inoperable brain tumor. Her cannabis was grown by caregivers in California and never crossed state lines. The DEA had raided her caregivers' homes and destroyed the plants. Reich argued that the federal government's Commerce Clause authority did not extend to locally grown cannabis consumed by a California patient under California law. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that it did. Even locally grown, locally consumed cannabis could be regulated by the federal government under the Commerce Clause because cannabis existed in an interstate market and local production affected that market. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a dissent, joined by Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justice Thomas, arguing that the majority had effectively made the 10th Amendment a dead letter, that if Congress could regulate a California patient's homegrown medicine, there was nothing it could not regulate. The case was decided in favor of federal authority, but it did not end the state revolt. It only clarified the legal landscape in which the revolt was continuing. The period between 2005 and 2012 was one in which state medical cannabis systems expanded despite federal enforcement. The Obama administration, which took office in 2009, initially signaled a more permissive approach. A Justice Department memo from Deputy Attorney General David Ogden in October 2009 instructed federal prosecutors not to prioritize enforcement against state-compliant medical cannabis operations. The memo was widely celebrated and widely misunderstood. It was a prosecutorial priority guidance, not a change in law, and it was subsequently interpreted more narrowly than advocates had hoped. The real breakthrough came in November 2012, when voters in Colorado and Washington approved ballot initiatives legalizing cannabis for adult recreational use, not just medical use. This was a qualitatively different kind of challenge to federal prohibition. Medical cannabis could be framed, and was in some quarters, as a compassionate exception for sick people. Recreational legalization made an explicit claim that adults had the right to use cannabis for pleasure, that the state had the authority to regulate that use, and that the federal government's Schedule I classification was wrong. The Justice Department response under Attorney General Eric Holder was another prosecutorial guidance memo, the Cole Memorandum of August 2013, which outlined a set of enforcement priorities that federal prosecutors should focus on in cannabis legal states, and implicitly suggested that state-compliant recreational cannabis operations that avoided those priorities would not be federal enforcement priorities. The Cole memo was not law. It could be withdrawn at any time by any subsequent Attorney General, but it provided enough cover for an industry to begin developing. Oregon, Alaska, and the District of Columbia legalized recreational cannabis in 2014. Massachusetts, Nevada, California, Maine, and Vermont followed in 2016 and 2017. By 2020, more than a third of American states had legalized recreational cannabis, and 2/3 had legal medical cannabis programs. The Schedule I classification remained in place. Federal law had not changed, but the political calculation had changed so thoroughly that the gap between federal law and the lived reality of cannabis policy in most of the country had become, in practical terms, enormous. The state-by-state legalization movement was not, in the end, a revolution led by activists. It was a process driven by tax revenue, by criminal justice reform advocates, by medical patients, by entrepreneurs who saw a multi-billion-dollar market emerging, and by ordinary voters who had lived their entire lives knowing people who used cannabis without apparent harm and had been waiting for years for the politics to catch up with that observation. The dispensary model that developed in California after Proposition 215 was not anticipated by the initiative's drafters and was not legally structured by it. The initiative created a medical defense for patients and their primary caregivers, but said nothing about retail distribution. What emerged in response to the practical demand for patient access was a grey market ecosystem of storefronts that called themselves dispensaries or collectives, operated under varying legal interpretations, and served populations that range from people with serious medical conditions to people with doctors' recommendations for conditions as diffuse as chronic stress. The California dispensary system's legal ambiguity became a persistent source of conflict. Local governments had authority to regulate land use, and many municipalities used that authority to ban dispensaries within their borders or to zone them into industrial areas far from residential neighborhoods. Los Angeles at one point had more than 1,000 operating dispensaries, then conducted a series of crackdowns that reduced that number dramatically. The regulatory instability was expensive for legitimate operators and lucrative for those willing to operate outside whatever rules happened to be in force at any given moment. The voter-driven nature of cannabis legalization in the United States, accomplished primarily through ballot initiatives rather than through legislative action, produced legal landscapes of considerable variation. Colorado's Amendment 64, which passed in 2012, created a regulated recreational market with licensing requirements, potency testing, track and trace inventory systems, and tax structures that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Washington's Initiative 502, passed the same night, created a different model with different regulatory structures. The two systems were compared carefully by researchers over the following years, producing data on the effects of different regulatory approaches that had not existed before, because no regulated cannabis market had existed to study. The data that accumulated in the years after Colorado and Washington legalization complicated several of the predictions that had been made about what recreational legalization would produce. Teen cannabis use rates did not dramatically increase in the immediate years after legalization. They remained roughly stable, which was the opposite of what prohibition advocates had predicted. Traffic fatality rates associated with cannabis-impaired driving were studied extensively and produced inconsistent results across different methodologies. Arrests for cannabis possession dropped dramatically and immediately. Tax revenues exceeded projections in most states. Black market activity persisted at a significant level, partly because heavily taxed legal cannabis was priced considerably above untaxed illegal cannabis. The effects of legalization on Black and Latino communities, which had borne the disproportionate enforcement burden of prohibition, were more mixed than advocates had hoped. In several states, the expungement of prior cannabis convictions was initially excluded from legalization legislation and had to be added through subsequent legislative action. The licensing systems for cannabis businesses created financial and regulatory barriers that made it difficult for individuals from communities most harmed by prohibition to enter the legal industry. The cannabis industry that emerged from legalization was, in most states, predominantly white and capital-intensive in ways that reflected and reproduced existing economic inequalities. The federal legal situation remained unresolved through the first decade of widespread state legalization. The Cole Memorandum provided practical guidance, but not legal protection. Banks largely refused to provide services to cannabis businesses because of federal money laundering concerns, forcing legal cannabis retailers to operate as cash-intensive businesses, which created security risks and made normal business functions like payroll and tax payment complicated. Cannabis businesses could not deduct ordinary business expenses from their federal taxes, under a tax code provision originally intended for illegal drug traffickers. The gap between state legal cannabis commerce and federal prohibition created a regulatory limbo whose costs were borne primarily by the businesses and workers operating within it. The social meaning of cannabis legalization varied considerably across the communities where it occurred. In communities where decades of enforcement had produced lasting damage, disrupted families, limited employment opportunities for people with records, deep mistrust of law enforcement, the arrival of a taxed and regulated cannabis industry was experienced with complicated feelings. It represented acknowledgement that the previous policy had been wrong. It did not represent repair of the damage that policy had done. The system they did not know existed, the science the prohibition delayed. In 1964, an Israeli chemist named Raphael Mechoulam, working at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, became the first person to isolate and identify the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. He called it delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. We know it as THC. Mechoulam synthesized it from a kilogram of Lebanese hashish that he had obtained from the Israeli National Police. He had simply asked them for it, explaining his research purposes, and they had provided it. This would not have been possible in the United States, where Schedule I restrictions had already made cannabis research almost impossible to conduct. that the most important cannabis chemistry of the 20th century was done in Israel rather than in the American universities and pharmaceutical laboratories that were otherwise leading the world in pharmacological research is not coincidental. Mechoulam's isolation of THC was the beginning of something much larger. Once chemists knew what the active compound was, they could study how it worked, which meant understanding what in the human body it was working on. The mechanism by which THC produced its effects was not immediately apparent. The molecule was lipid-soluble, which meant it dissolved in fats rather than water, and its interaction with the human nervous system was not through any receptor type that had been previously identified. The answer arrived in 1988, when a researcher named Alan Howlett, working at St. Louis University, discovered that the brain contained specific receptor sites that responded to THC. She called them CB1 receptors. They were present in extraordinary abundance in the brain, more densely distributed than any other G-protein coupled receptor yet identified. They were concentrated in the regions associated with memory, motor control, pain processing, appetite, and emotional regulation. The brain had not evolved these receptors in order to interact with cannabis. It had evolved them for some internal purpose, which meant there had to be an internal chemical that used them. That internal chemical, the endogenous cannabinoid, or endocannabinoid, was identified by Mechoulam and his colleagues in 1992. They named it anandamide, from the Sanskrit word for bliss, ananda. In 1995, a second endocannabinoid was identified, 2-arachidonyl glycerol, or 2-AG. Together, these two molecules and the receptors that responded to them constituted what researchers named the endocannabinoid system, a signaling network distributed throughout the human body, present in the brain, the immune system, the reproductive system, the gastrointestinal system, and virtually every major organ. The endocannabinoid system regulates, among other things, pain response, inflammatory response, immune function, appetite, memory formation and erasure, stress response, and the fine motor control of the nervous system. It is, by the account of the researchers who study it, one of the most important regulatory systems in the human body. It is also one of the most recently discovered, and the primary reason its discovery was delayed by several decades is that the compound that activates it most potently was, during the period when it might otherwise have been studied, classified as a Schedule I substance with no accepted medical use, making the research required to understand it extraordinarily difficult to conduct. Mechoulam himself made this point repeatedly in interviews given in his later career. He noted that cannabis had been in continuous medical use for thousands of years and had been the subject of serious clinical investigation since O'Shaughnessy's 1839 paper, and yet the pharmacological mechanism by which it worked had remained unknown until 1988, more than a century and a half after that paper, largely because American research restrictions had made sustained laboratory investigation impractical. The endocannabinoid system, he suggested, might have been identified decades earlier under different regulatory conditions. What the discovery of the endocannabinoid system revealed, retroactively, was why cannabis had been so persistently useful in so many different conditions across so many different cultures over so many centuries. A compound that activates a system involved in pain regulation, inflammation, appetite, anxiety, and memory can logically be expected to have clinical effects on pain, inflammation, appetite, anxiety, and memory. The empirical observation of ancient physicians in China and India and Egypt that this plant did something useful was vindicated at a mechanistic level 2,000 years after those observations were first recorded. The specific cannabinoid that did not get THC's early attention was cannabidiol, known as CBD. CBD was also isolated by Mechoulam. He identified it before THC in 1963. But because it produced no psychoactive effects, it attracted less research attention during the years when even the modest amount of cannabis research that was occurring was focused on understanding the high. CBD's own receptor profile and its distinct clinical effects were not seriously investigated until the 1990s and later. The discovery that CBD had significant anticonvulsant properties, that it could dramatically reduce seizure frequency in certain treatment-resistant forms of epilepsy, was made primarily by parents of affected children who had read research papers and had nothing to lose. Their advocacy, conducted mostly online and outside the formal medical establishment, drove the clinical research that eventually produced the first FDA-approved cannabis-derived medication in 2018, Epidiolex, a purified CBD formulation for two rare forms of childhood epilepsy. The story of the endocannabinoid system is, among other things, a story about the cost of political decisions that impede scientific inquiry. The regulatory structure created in 1937 and reinforced in 1970 did not merely prevent people from using cannabis, it prevented researchers from understanding a fundamental system of human physiology. The specific mechanisms by which cannabis might help patients with multiple sclerosis, with post-traumatic stress disorder, with certain cancers, with nausea from chemotherapy, with the neuropathic pain that resists ordinary analgesics, all of these were investigated decades later than they might have been, by researchers working around regulatory obstacles that existed not because the science suggested the research was dangerous, but because a government official in the 1930s had needed a drug to prohibit. Mechoulam received the Israel Prize, the Harvey Prize, and numerous honorary doctorates in the course of his long career. He continued working into his late 80s. He was asked, in an interview, given a few years before his death in 2023, whether he was frustrated by the delays that Prohibition had imposed on cannabis research. He paused before answering. He said that he had come to think of the delays less as frustrating than as instructive, as evidence that the political categorization of substances and the scientific understanding of those substances were entirely separate projects, operating on entirely separate timelines, and that the overlap between them was much smaller than most people assumed. He was 92 years old when he died. He had spent 60 years trying to understand a plant that human beings had been using for 12,000 years without knowing why it worked. The reasons it had taken so long to find out were, he said, not complicated. They were simply not scientific. The specific story of how CBD came to public attention in the United States is one of the more remarkable episodes in recent medical history. In 2012, a Colorado family named Figgy had a daughter named Charlotte who suffered from Dravet syndrome, a severe form of epilepsy that was not responding to any of the standard anticonvulsant medications available. Charlotte was having up to 300 grand mal seizures per week. She was 5 years old. Her parents had read about cannabidiol's anticonvulsant properties in scientific literature and eventually found a Colorado cannabis producer willing to develop a high CBD, low THC strain for her. The preparation dramatically reduced her seizures from 300 per week to roughly 2 or 3 per month. Charlotte Figgy's story was reported by CNN journalist Sanjay Gupta in a 2013 documentary called Weed, in which Gupta also publicly reversed his earlier opposition to medical cannabis. The documentary was watched by millions of people. The Charlotte's Web strain, named for Charlotte Figgy, became the most sought-after medical cannabis product in the United States, and the Figgy family received inquiries from families across the country, asking how they could access the same treatment for their own children. The movement of families to Colorado specifically to access this preparation was dubbed the cannabis migration, and it contributed to the political pressure that produced the federal rescheduling of CBD-derived Epidiolex in 2018. Raphael Mechoulam's scientific legacy extends beyond the identification of THC and the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. He spent his career systematically mapping the cannabinoid pharmacology of the human body, identifying not only the main endocannabinoids, but a series of related compounds, the entourage effect molecules, that appeared to modulate and enhance the actions of the primary cannabinoids. His later work suggested that the clinical effects of whole plant cannabis preparations might differ meaningfully from the effects of isolated THC or CBD, because the dozens of other compounds present in the plant interacted with human receptor systems in ways that isolated compounds did not reproduce. This finding had significant implications for the pharmaceutical development of cannabis medicines. It suggested that the whole plant might have clinical properties that no single extracted compound could replicate. The research that was not done during the Prohibition years represents a scientific cost whose scale is genuinely difficult to estimate. The endocannabinoid system's role in conditions including anxiety disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, and certain forms of chronic pain was not understood until the 1990s and later, and clinical research into cannabis treatments for these conditions is still in relatively early stages. The randomized controlled trials that would be needed to establish cannabis's efficacy and optimal dosing for specific conditions, the kind of trials that any other potential medication would have accumulated over decades, have not been conducted at the scale that the questions warrant, partly because of ongoing research restrictions and partly because of the commercial structures of drug development, which depend on patent protection that natural plant products cannot receive. The specific prohibition on cannabis research in the United States was not an absolute ban. Schedule I substances could be studied with DEA and FDA approval, but the regulatory pathway was so burdensome that it functioned as a near-effective prohibition in practice. Until 2021, the only federally licensed cannabis for research purposes was grown at the University of Mississippi under a National Institute on Drug Abuse contract. The Mississippi cannabis was of a quality and range that researchers described as inadequate for studying the products that consumers were actually using. It did not reflect the potency, the variety of strains, or the delivery methods available in legal state markets. Studies conducted on Mississippi cannabis might not be applicable to the cannabis that millions of Americans were actually consuming. The 2021 decision by the DEA to license additional cannabis research cultivators was a significant regulatory change, and the FDA's 2022 recommendation that cannabis be rescheduled from Schedule I to Schedule III represented the first formal movement in the federal classification system since Nixon had made the Schedule I designation permanent. Schedule III would not legalize cannabis. It would not create a federal regulatory framework for cannabis commerce. But it would remove cannabis from the category of substances with no accepted medical use and no accepted research value, a categorization that had been clinically unsupportable since at least the 1970s and that its own institutional architects had privately acknowledged was politically rather than scientifically motivated. The scientists who spent their careers working on cannabis pharmacology under the constraints of prohibition did so, in most cases, from a position of genuine scientific interest, unclouded by political commitment. McCollum himself was notably careful to avoid political statements about drug policy. He described himself as a chemist interested in an interesting molecule, not an advocate for any particular legal arrangement. The scientific questions about the endocannabinoid system, how it works, what it regulates, how it can be therapeutically targeted, are questions with answers that matter regardless of what any government decides to do about the plant that first drew researchers' attention to the system. Those questions are still being answered in laboratories around the world by researchers who are working now with fewer regulatory obstacles than their predecessors faced and a better understanding of what they are looking for. What the records remember. The arc of cannabis history does not bend toward any simple conclusion. It does not end with vindication exactly, or with tragedy exactly. It ends where most histories of contested things end, in the middle of an argument that is still being had by people who are still alive about consequences that are still unfolding. What the records do allow is a kind of accounting. The plant that humans first used roughly 12,000 years ago, the same plant that was pressed into rope in ancient China, burned in Scythian sweat lodges, ground with milk for Hindu festivals, prescribed by Victorian physicians, mandated by colonial law, turned into a racial slur, criminalized, studied, suppressed, and gradually, haltingly decriminalized. That plant is now, in one form or another, legal in most of the United States and in an increasing number of countries worldwide. The Schedule I classification remains in federal law. The DEA has declined to reschedule it on multiple occasions. But in practical terms, the enforcement architecture that Harry Anslinger spent his career constructing has been substantially dismantled, state by state, vote by vote, across the first 2 decades of the 21st century. What was lost in the years between 1937 and the late 1990s is harder to calculate. There are the individuals, the hundreds of thousands of people arrested for cannabis possession over those decades, disproportionately Black and Latino, whose criminal records followed them in ways that affected employment, housing, voting rights, and parental custody for the rest of their lives. There are the communities disrupted by enforcement campaigns whose primary effect was not to reduce cannabis use. Surveys consistently showed that use rates were not strongly correlated with enforcement intensity, but to concentrate the disruptions of enforcement in specific communities. There is the medical knowledge that was not developed, the researchers who did not pursue cannabis studies because the regulatory environment made them impossible or career-limiting, the patients who did not receive treatments that might have helped them because those treatments were classified as having no accepted medical use, the 25 years of endocannabinoid research that might have happened in the 1960s and 1970s if the people who might have conducted it had been able to obtain research supplies from somewhere other than the one licensed government grow operation in Oxford, Mississippi. And there is something harder to name, a quality of civic honesty that is damaged when a government maintains for decades that a substance has no medical use, while simultaneously supplying that substance to patients through a secret program, while prosecuting physicians for discussing it with patients, while funding the study of it in order to prove its dangers and finding instead evidence of its utility. The distance between official position and operational reality, maintained over decades and across multiple administrations of both parties, is a kind of sustained institutional dishonesty whose effects on public trust in medical and governmental institutions are difficult to measure, but are probably not small. Raymond Schaefer, the Republican governor who chaired the commission that recommended decriminalizing cannabis in 1972, spent the rest of his life being asked about the report that Richard Nixon had rejected. He died in 2006. In interviews given in his later years, he said that he had expected the commission's findings to be controversial, but had not expected them to be suppressed. He said that what struck him most, looking back, was how little the scientific evidence had been allowed to matter. The commission had been assembled precisely because its members were trusted figures, not radicals, not advocates, and its conclusions had been dismissed anyway. He said he thought about that sometimes. The people who appear in the margins of this history, Brownie Mary bringing cookies to dying men, Robert Randall arguing in a Washington courtroom that he needed his plants to see, William Brooke O'Shaughnessy watching a child's convulsions ease in a Calcutta hospital, are not, for the most part, people who thought of themselves as being on the front lines of a political battle. They were people who had noticed something, and who could not stop noticing it, and who continued saying what they had noticed even when it was professionally or legally risky to do so. That persistence, repeated across a century of institutional opposition, is part of what eventually moved the politics. Not the only part, not even the largest part, but a part. The plant itself has no opinion about any of this. It grows where it is planted and in some places where it is not. It has survived ice ages and empires and prohibition statutes and DEA raids. Whatever human beings have decided it represents, sacred gift, soldier's comfort, patent medicine, moral hazard, racial threat, medical miracle, billion-dollar industry, it has continued to produce the same compounds in roughly the same proportions, responding to the same receptors that the human body evolved to respond to it, for reasons that are still being worked out by researchers who are working now, tonight, in laboratories that are somewhat easier to operate than they were 30 years ago. Though not entirely free of complications, the work continues. It tends to. The cannabis story's most persistent feature is its repetitiveness. The same arguments about the plant's danger or harmlessness appear in different registers across centuries of documentation. The same observations about its medical utility are made, forgotten, made again, forgotten again, made a third time with the confidence of discovery. The same racial and class dynamics in its legal treatment appear in Victorian England's concerns about lower-class hashish imports, in early 20th century American anxiety about Mexican immigrants, in the racially disparate enforcement of Prohibition through the late 20th century, and in the slow and incomplete equity provisions of early 21st century legalization. This repetitiveness is not evidence that nothing has changed. It is evidence that certain human tendencies, the tendency to use drug policy as a proxy for social control, the tendency to disregard inconvenient scientific evidence when it conflicts with political need, the tendency to forget the conclusions of previous investigations and conduct them again, are persistent enough to reassert themselves across very different historical contexts. The story of cannabis is, in part, a story about institutional memory and its limits. The approximately 700,000 Americans who were arrested annually for cannabis possession in the decade before widespread state legalization, a number larger than the total arrests for all violent crimes combined, entered the criminal justice system and encountered its consequences for a substance whose pharmacological danger profile was, by the assessment of the government's own commissioned researchers in 1972, not sufficient to justify the criminal penalties being applied. They represent a very large number of individual stories that do not appear in the history of the plant, but that are part of it as surely as any Senate hearing or Supreme Court decision. What remains, on the other side of the Prohibition era that is now gradually ending, is a set of questions that the politics have not resolved and that the science is still working on. What is the appropriate regulatory model for a substance that is mildly intoxicating, generally safe for adults, potentially harmful for adolescents, medicinally useful in certain conditions, and whose therapeutic applications are still being worked out? What does repair look like for communities where prohibition caused measurable and documented harm? What does the endocannabinoid system's central role in human physiology mean for how we understand health and disease? These are real questions with complex answers that will take years of careful work to develop. The plant waits with something that, if it had feelings, might be called patience. It has been waiting a long time. The Sedated History Channel has more evenings like this one, the history of laudanum, of heroin, of the patent medicine era. If you'd like to keep going, they're waiting for you. Let the story settle now. There is no need to hold it tightly. Somewhere tonight, in a field that has been planted and replanted for more generations than anyone alive can count, something is growing in the dark. Not urgently, not dramatically. The way things grow when no one is watching, slowly, in accordance with conditions that existed long before anyone named them. The smoke from Scythian fires has long since risen and dispersed. The bottles of Park Davis cannabis tincture that sat on Victorian pharmacy shelves have been empty for 100 years. The tin canisters from the government's secret warehouse have been opened and opened again by hands that needed them. The papers have been filed. The votes have been counted. The commissioners have given their reports, and the reports have been accepted or rejected, or simply set aside until the world caught up with what they said. What remains is quieter than the argument about it. The fields are dark, the laboratories are still, the court records sit in their boxes, the tape recordings have been transcribed and the transcriptions have been read, and the people who made them are gone. The grandfather of all of this, the plant itself, patient, uncommitted, indifferent to the uses it has been put to, continues doing what it does. You are somewhere warm and horizontal. The weight of your body is distributed across whatever surface holds you, and that surface is holding you without effort. The way surfaces do, because that is what they are for. The story has been told. The names have been spoken into the quiet. O'Shaughnessy, Anslinger, McCoolum, Schaefer, Brownie Mary, and they have faded back into the general dark from which all names eventually come. The fields are far away. The arguments are far away. The distance between where you are and anywhere else is exactly the distance that it is, and it is enough. Nothing needs to be resolved tonight. Nothing is waiting for you. The history has been happening for 12,000 years, and it will continue in the morning, and you will be there for it, rested, returned to yourself, ready. For now, let the dark be dark. Let the quiet be quiet. Let whatever is still moving in your thoughts slow and settle and come to rest like sediment in still water, gradually, without effort, until the water is clear and the bottom is visible and there is nothing left to look for. Sleep well. If you enjoyed this story, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if there's a substance or chapter of history you'd like me to cover next, leave it in the comments below. If any of this is settling into sleep, good. Before you go, what's the oldest use of cannabis you'd ever heard of before tonight? Leave it in the comments when you wake.